Okay, so in this video, we're actually going to walk through setting up the remainder of our templates needed for the home page, set up the featured jobs section, which will get us into calling REST API for a SharePoint list. And we'll walk through setting up that list, the schema that we will initially start with, and then kind of go from there. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So if you remember from the last video, we went through and we wired up our AngularJS framework, and that allowed us to pull in some templates. In this video, what we're going to do, let's go ahead and finish building that out. So if we go to our Visual Studio project, go to the design section, and let's take a look at the index file provided by the designer. And within here, we did not bring in the carousel, so let's go ahead and bring that in, the featured jobs, browse jobs, testimonials. I don't think we're going to use all of these, but let's go ahead and bring them all in just for the sake of consistency. So what I'm going to do, let's go back and find this guy. So we are in the index file. We have already brought in the header, and now we need to bring in the slideshow. So if you recall, all you have to do is copy this guy, go to let me just collapse the design package for now. We don't need the master page section. We're going to go here in the style library, and as you recall, right here in our app directory, we have a templates folder, and this is where all our HTML is going to go. So let's just go ahead and add in HTML. Again, I'm prefixing. No, for the template, I'm not going to prefix everything with JP. That's going to be more so in the component. So let's just name it slideshow. We'll just take the name that the designer provided us. Select all, paste it in. And what I'm going to do, I'm just go through and repeat this exact same process for all of these sections. Oh, I lost my design file. Where'd my design file go? For all of these sections in this index.html. This is featured jobs. So let's call this featured jobs. And I actually should be using snake case. So featured -jobs. Hit OK. Again, this is all preference. If you get it wrong, it's not a big deal. You can always correct it. These things are easy to rename. They're easy to rewire up. They're just a bunch of different layers and Lego blocks, if you would. And it was just easier it'll be easier if you make a mistake or the design or your structure changes. It's a little bit easier to correct those. Okay, so for featured jobs, let me go in here, paste this HTML in. I want to make sure I grab the right one. Okay, featured jobs, save that off. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause the video, go ahead and stamp these out. Again, all we're doing is just going through each one of these sections and creating HTML files for each one of them. Okay, so how do we do? So here you will see the list of the templates that I created. These should be pretty straightforward to where you can easily match these up. I did do a rename for jobs, featured jobs to jobs featured, only because I like to start off my naming convention with the actual feature and then the characteristics of that. As we move along, we probably would encounter a job summary, jobs detail, so on and so forth. So if you prefix these correctly based on the feature and then the characteristics or the subset of that feature, then they will be grouped together. Again, it's just all about keeping things that are related close together with the tricks of the name. Now, if you look at my template list here that we ended up with, the top nav is kind of breaking our naming conventions using snake case. So let's go ahead and correct that. So we want to just name this top-nav. And now our reference to that file is going to be broken. So we have to put a hyphen there. And just remember that when we deploy this, what's going to happen is SharePoint's not going to look at this as a rename. It's going to look at this as a new file. So we have to explicitly go back and remove that file. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get to our components. Now, as I mentioned in the last one, right now we're dependent on the root site collection or the main site collection because of our relative path. If you're dealing with a site collection that you've been provisioned with, then you may not have this luxury, and this may be hard coded to your site collection. Anything hard coded is just not going to be supported as we move from environment to environment. So before we create components for each one of these templates that we just created, let's go ahead and make this URL piece dynamic. So the first thing we have to do, if you recall in the last video, we ran into an issue when we tried to bring in our services. Our services file is going to be where we store all of our, really this is where all the heavy lifting or the heavy work is going to be done. I did some research between videos and realized why this was not working. It's because we really have to have this fully qualified or stamped out. One of the things I do want to do, because we were a little bit choppy with implementing this, I actually want to do this from scratch. So I'm going to keep this piece up here as a reference. And let's go ahead and start building our services file. And once we get the top layer built, we're actually going to delete this, but we're going to leave it as a reference. So we first start with the double parenthesis, and then there's semicolon. You always have to remember those semicolons. And this is going to be our anonymous function. And the meat of everything that we do is going to be here. The first thing we want to do is turn on the strict mode. And this is just going to protect us as we develop. It's going to catch any known issues during runtime so that we catch them during the development phase and not be scratching our head when something comes up in the future. And what we have to do, if you recall, this JP app is just a local variable for it's a global variable within our app for the actual Angular module. And then to append any reusable service, we have to define that as a factory. And we can give this any name that we want. I just want to go with SVC as our service. And then we have an array of objects that we have to pass. Now, because we want this to be compatible for minification, we have to do these single strings to bring in the various modules. So our HTTP module, that's needed for all of our REST API calls. Our queue module is going to be needed for any promises or defers that we have to create. You're going to get promises out of the box, but there are certain scenarios where we need more control over that. And we'll talk through that. And then once we have, then our next element in the array is going to be the actual function for the service. And this is where all the meat and potatoes will go. Now, when we do our function, we have to redefine our modules, right? Because the ones in the quotes or the string versions of this is really just for minification compatibility. This is actually the true syntax that's needed, that's required by Angular. So we do the curly brace, and we definitely do our semicolon, and then we bring this guy, we expand the curly brace so that way we get to the meat. So the other piece with the factory is that you have to return the object, and this is our return object here. Anything that we define here is going to be available through the caller. So these are going to be what we consider public methods. Anything above the return is going to be a private method. And this is the same format that's used in React. So again, this model is something that will be reusable and maintained through when we get to modern SharePoint development leveraging React. So one of the things we want to do, we need to get the current URL for the site collection. And as we know within SharePoint, that's going to be pretty dynamic. So let's just call this site URL. And for right now, let's just set this to an empty string. And then what we have to do, because obviously they cannot, as we mentioned before, they cannot access these private members to anything above the return. So we have to expose this local variable, very similar to C# programming, right, in the class library. So what we're going to do, we're going to call this get, and these are going to come in the form of properties. This is where a property is a function. You can pass a function as a parameter, blah, 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 blah. So this is going to be a function. So we're going to just call this get. It's going to getters and setters, right? So get site URL, and we have to define it as a function. There's no parameters being passed, and all we're going to do is return the site URL. Now you may see this double return that may actually cause some grief. You have a return here and you have a return here, and they're actually two separate things. This return here is actually to the service itself and exposing this as an object. It actually exposed the service as an object. And this curly brace here is actually doing it as returning it as an object. And as a member of this, we have this function. Now, this is where we kind of deviate from C# and properties, functions, and all this other good stuff versus what we can some would call true object-oriented programming, where a function is just a member of an object versus a separate entity that we kind of treat it as such in C#. So we're going to pass. So as a member of this object, this get site URL is going to be the function, and we call that function, and basically it's going to return our private member here. Okay. So let's just go and make sure that we have everything wired up. And what I like to do is is label these ending brackets, and part of that sorry, I'm sorry, I can't type and think and talk at the same time. So part of that is because when this file here, the expectation is that this file is, from my experience, it's going to get very long, and after a while you're going to see a lot of these guys here, because these are going to represent the business objects, that the business layer that we're going to call from the controller. And this is going to allow us to keep our controller squeaky clean and really focused on the duties and the responsibilities that controllers should have. And we'll talk more about that as we kind of build this out, because I want to do those as use cases as those cases present themselves. And then the other one, this is just our main anonymous function, or namespace, if you would, that kind of keep everything within a certain area within the DOM and not in the overall DOM global namespace, which makes Angular so much cleaner, because whatever you're doing here is going to be in the context of what's defined inside. And if you need to access anything inside of here, you have to do that via the service reference object here. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this. I'm somewhat confident that this is going to work. Let's just save this all. And let's go to our components, and now we should be able to safely reference that service object, because everything is wired up to this main module. That's how we get access to it, because we're all following the module. The component is just a member of that. The factory we define is just a member of that. And we're passing this service object. So now that we have this service object, you see me playing here. This is me just trying to figure this out and then finally getting this thing to work. Based on this service object that you pass in, any public member or function or property that we define, now we have access to that. And this guy, if we bounce back over to the services, should match this guy. And I do a lot of copy and paste, because you're not going to get IntelliSense or any squeaks or compile errors now that we are in JavaScript that's going to say that this is spelled incorrectly, or you have an extra space, or the casing is incorrect. You're not going to get that. So copy and paste is going to be your best friend. Okay, so this component, this JP top nav, is now wired up to use this service. And what we end up doing was, because we talked about the disk and setting that to a local variable. So now I can do a control.site URL, set this equal to the service behind the scenes, and now my component has access a local copy of that site URL. And we want a local copy because now we need this guy to be leveraged by the template itself. So if we go inside the template, and I did rename that, right? Yes. So if we go inside the template, let's go into top nav. And if I want to use that site URL, let me find a place where we would need it. Oh, for top nav, there's probably no need for it right now. You know what? Let's just spit it out. So if I want to use it, the syntax is that you have to use a double curly brace. And we defined our alias that the template is going to reference the controller with. And that alias is VM, and then whatever the local variable that we gave it. Now let's go back and make sure that we're matching these up and you understand where these are coming from. So this VM, if we go back to our component, remember this controller as, that's how you represent the controller inside the template itself. The site URL, so it's VM dot, and whatever we define here, we have access to those same members. Again, this is just an alias of this object here. So whatever property you define on those objects, you will have access to them, just casing them that way. Correct spelling, casing, casing, and all this other good stuff. Okay, so this should be wired up. So let's go ahead and push all of this out. I'm gonna just grab it at the app folder and then hit publish. Again, if you get an error during publishing, that means that you do not have an instance of any library on your SharePoint site in Windows Explorer view. That's what's going to do the behind the scenes authentication in order to make this magic work. Okay, so this is pushing out 13, 14, let's go. All right, so now we go to SharePoint, hit refresh. And I'm not expecting to see any UI changes because we actually haven't defined anything different. We just wired something up in the back end, but we're not passing anything to that variable. The one concern I do have, if I go to inspect and take a look at the console, I don't want to see any errors. The expectation is that there's no errors here. And before we were getting an error when we were trying to reference that service object. So let's go back to the component, right? So we got this get site URL, and we bounce over to our service. Let me close all of this. This is starting to get a little unwieldy. Okay, so underscore site URL. Let's just pass in Yahoo for kicks and giggles. And then let's just go ahead and publish this up. From this one change, the expectation is that I should now see Yahoo pop up. Where are we displaying it in our template? And this guy here in the site URL next to contact us. So let's see how well we do. Hit the refresh. And there it is. So it's that easy. So now we're fully wired and framed for our Angular application. So we have our controller talking to our template, which then in turns go to the services, get some information, some data, and then pass that all the way up. So in the order of operation, the way it works, this is how it works, right? Sorry, I'm just going through it in my head. Yes. So the way it works is that we hit our master page. That master page in turn let's just walk through this very quickly, because I think understanding the flow is going to be critical. And if things go awry or if things go wrong, we know where to start to look. So, this is so ugly. Okay, so our master page gets hit. So SharePoint is serving up the master page. It then encounters these these custom tags, right? These controllers. Based on this controller, based on these tags, these custom tags, it's going to send this to Angular. Is going to kick in and say, oh, I got this guy. I know exactly what this is. So it tries to take this JP top nav and match it up to the component that matches the name. And again, we talked about the difference on how you represent this camel casing when you're defining a tag. That's just a naming convention defined in Angular. Once it encounters this, it goes through and it executes everything in the controller function first. So it's going to call this controller function. And the controller, so it's going to call this controller, then it calls the template, and then the bind. I don't know if it goes in this order. Actually, I don't know which order it goes in, but I know it calls this controller first, and then the controller would then in turn call the services, get the backend data. Meantime, I think this may be more of a AJAX call, like a asynchronous call, to where it will actually pull in the template as well. And then there is the timing piece, right? To where you're going to get this data, there's promises passed back and all this other good stuff. And once a promise is hydrated, you would then be able to see that within your template here. So that's the order of operations. So it hits the master page, or in our case, it's going to be master page, potentially, eventually page layout, and then any tag that it encounters, Angular kicks in and say, yep, I know what that custom tag is. It tries to match it to the component. The component then runs through and do its thing. It gets the data hydrated, and everything is married together. Pretty cool, actually. Now, if you define something, let's just call this nav3, right? And this is the one that's going to trip you up, I promise you, because it trips me up all the time. And let's just publish this out. The thing that's going to happen is that you actually are not going to get any type of an exception because custom markup tags are valid in HTML5 or HTML4. I'm not sure which version those started, but these are valid to customize these. So everyone's just going to throw their hands up like, it's not my guy, it's not my guy, it's not my guy. And then so there's not going to be anything. And that's probably the one most frustrating piece out of this model is because you have something defined, you won't see anything, you won't get any errors. And it's really just going back and say, okay, where did I use that tag? And if you're doing a bunch of changes at one time and you got several of these are mixed up or not matching correctly, then you're going to get a that can be kind of nerve-wracking, if you would. So, I think that in short, when working with this JavaScript piece or Angular or any JavaScript framework, it's always best practice to do small changes in chunks, verify, change, verify, change, verify, change, verify, until you get to the point to where you're comfortable. Even now, I mean, I've been working with this model here, Angular SharePoint, for probably about 4 years now, 4 years, probably three. So 3 years now, and even I are very careful with when I make changes and making sure that I'm verifying in between them. Okay, so now that we have this piece here, let's go ahead and wire this up to leverage the dynamically pull in the SharePoint URL for the site collection. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to pull on one of the best tricks in REST API or front-end development within SharePoint, and that's going to be this guy here. Let's go to our services, and instead of Yahoo, let's actually use something that's more useful. Underscore SP page context info. This is going to be very similar, very limited, but similar in if you think it in the sense of SP context when you're doing full trusted SharePoint development, and where you can get like the current URL, the current web's URL, the current site, SP site URL, the current user information, yada, yada, yada. So this underscore SP context is going to give you that. As long as you're running this in the context of SharePoint, this is going to be available. It gets hydrated by the master page or somewhere very early in the cycle that by the time it gets to you, it's already hydrated and ready to go. And you don't have to make any AJAX calls to get information on here. Now, there are several members on here, so let's see what's available. And to do that, I'm gonna just take that name, that keyword of the object, and go to Sahil's site, and he has this wonderful charting that allows you, and this is available in SharePoint 2016 as well, but it just allows you to understand the different members are available. Again, this is JavaScript, so you're not going to get the IntelliSense, well, this is JavaScript without TypeScript. So you're not going to get the IntelliSense that you're looking for to where you do a dot and then all of a sudden it's just like, these are all the members available. So that's not going to be available to us. So as we look into this, the different properties are available. We can either do a absolute URL that's going to have the HTTP part of it for the site. There's one for the web. And obviously, if you're on the root site collection and the root web, these are going to be one and the same. But as you start to do additional site collections, you will start to, additional site collections and or you go to different subsites within the site collection, you would start to see the difference between them. So what do we want to grab? So we want to get this current site collections URL, and we want to do relative. So that's the web. Where's the one for the site? Site relative URL. And actually, you're just going to get a slash, right? So let's grab this guy and do a dot and whatever we just copied. And now that's going to set to the site URL. Go ahead and publish this up. Then go to the website, hit refresh. Okay, I lost my top nav because I changed the name, but I did not publish the master page, right? So we corrected the name here. So let's publish the master page again so we see the latest change. Hit refresh. All right, so now we have our top nav and we also have our slash. You see that? So this is going to give us the current site collections relative URL. And now what we need to do is to pass this guy from where I sit. It's not going to make sense because everything is just a slash and I already have a slash, but we want to make this dynamic. Now, in order to make this dynamic, this is going to be a little tricky and counterintuitive, but it took me a while to figure it out, and I got it figured out just by reusing this guy time and time again, or perfecting this model as it's used in previous projects. So the one thing that we can do is let's go ahead and stub this out, because this path is going to be the same regardless of the template name, right? And one of the things we want to try to minimize is how many times you repeat yourself. You want to try to minimize that. So let's just cut this stub piece out. Let's go to our services. And basically what we're going to do is create a function that says get template URL. And they can pass in the template name. And based on the template name, we're going to respond back with the URL path that's required. So we're just going to do template name. Let's append this to that. Right, and then we want to prefix this guy with the site URL. So let's just do underscore site URL plus and take out the extra slash. This guy's going to come down with a slash already added to it. And these have to be comma separated because they're members of an object. That's why we're getting that green squiggly. It was a syntax error, right? So site URL, which is defined here, and then we add in our custom path and we walk through that, how that's defined. And with the understanding that whatever site collection you're storing in, you're using the site library of that site collection versus the root. And then we're just appending the template name. Pretty straightforward, right? So now what we can do, let's set up a local, and this is where things get a little counterintuitive. Let's set up a local variable and we just call it temp URL. And in the temp URL, we're going to call this, basically give a call to our backend service. So sv get template URL. I'm doing something very dangerous here. I'm typing without copy and paste. And you just want to pass in the name of your template. Don't worry about the path. The path is already going to be encapsulated, stored for us. So that way, if we decide to move this whole template folder, maybe under design, I don't know why we would do that, but if we want to move this on the design folder, we go into one spot, update the path, and all the template references get updated. Okay, so we're going to set this to a local temp URL on the controller object. And now this is where things get a little bit tricky. So instead of the template URL property, we can use the template property where it expects you to define the template right here in the code behind or in the controller itself. So all I'm going to do is just define it as a div tag. But we still need to pass in this URL. So I'm going to define it as a div tag, and then I'm going to reference the URL that we define in the controller using this special notation ng include, which is like, you remember include files back in HTML, like back in the day, where you can do like an include file for the header, have that stored like in a shared directory, and you reference that every time that you do like an HTML file. Well, this is very similar to that. So there's going to be an include. I have to make a decision here, so I have to bring this in using double quotes and then represent the attribute quotes singular. Oops, this is an attribute of the div tag. Okay, So now we do the ng include, and basically it says go ahead and include this HTML file that lives somewhere else. And in order to bring it in, now I have to treat this template section as if I'm looking at the actual HTML. So to reference this controller, it's going to be the vm.temp URL. Now, the reason why we have to do this, because obviously you probably would say, well, Deshaun, just do the get site URL and append it to this guy here as the property. I tried that, and for some odd reason, this did not like a dynamic loading of the service, or the service object was not available to it. And I didn't research it long enough to figure out why. So I kind of came up with this workaround here after several blog posts and stitching things together, that this actually works pretty cool. Now, there's a couple things that we're doing here that, in one swoop, we're solving a lot of problems, but there's a couple goodness that's coming out of here. One, just realize that where we use template URL, there's another property, and it's either or. You can't use both at the same time. You can do a template to where you define your actual HTML here in the controller, and we'll talk about the pros of that. There's actually it actually saves you a network request if you do it this way. But obviously, you don't want this thing to be big and nasty, right? Like, you don't want this in the controller. That's just hard to maintain. You're not going to get the formatting and structure and intelligence. So it just becomes a pain in the butt. And obviously we see that a lot, right? A lot of jQuery solutions use that. A lot of raw JavaScript solutions use that, to where there's a bunch of HTML in the JavaScript. So here, if you're doing something simple like a button or a label or anything like that that represents that component, you don't have to fire up a separate HTML file to represent that HTML. You can just inline it here using the template property. But obviously, if you want something external or stored in a separate HTML file somewhere in the local directory, then the template URL is going to be your best friend. Now, if you needed to make it dynamic, which is our scenario, because we're dealing with SharePoint and site collections are obviously have their own URL, and there's no easy relative way to define that and make it reusable in multiple environments, we have to dynamically go off and use that SharePoint object to get the current site URL, pass it in from our services, append that to the template that we pass in, and then get the full URL, and then do this little trick here to make it to dynamically pull the URL. Okay. All right, that's a lot of yapping. Let's see if this works, actually. See if I have to take back any words. Okay, we made a few changes in several places. Let's just publish the folder itself. I'll pause the video until this is done. Okay, 14 out of 14. Let's see how did we do. So if we go to the website, the expectation is that we get the top nav here. We still have it, right? Let's do Control F5, make sure we're not just dealing with a cached version. Okay, so now we're all wired up, and we can safely go through each component and bring in the templates dynamically. And how are we going to do this? Simple, copy and paste. We don't need this site URL. Let's just keep it here for a reference, right? But we don't need that anywhere else. So let's just paste this guy here, and then paste this guy here. Oops. Let's actually get our name first. Copy, paste. The good news is this template property is going to be the same, right? Because all the dynamic stuff is done before this, so this is pretty static on how it gets wired up. Let's just add this guy here. Again, we only can use one of those properties at a time, template URL or template. So this is just a temporary measure until we get everything copied and paste. And let's get rid of this. Okay. All right. All those changes were in a component folder only, a component file only. So let's just publish that one. Make things a little bit quicker. All right. And go to our website. Control F5. Make sure we're getting the latest and greatest. Ooh, nice. Errors. Okay, so we know what we forgot, right? We're referencing the services object. That's that use strict. That's our safety net kicking in. Say, oh, you're jumping out of this plane without a parachute. Warning. Okay, so we have to pass in this object because we're referencing the object that says, hey, you're referencing something that you're not authorized to use, or you don't have any explicit indication that you need to use it to kind of make things safe. Okay, so we just need to pass in the services object into our function, and then once we pass it in, we can leverage it. All right, let's try this, republish again, and Control F5, refresh. There we go. So everything's popped in. It's all dynamic. And a good way to determine this, and hopefully if this helps you out. So if you were using your own site collection and you had to define like a different URL and now you're all hard coded, this would definitely help you out. So now in theory, what we can do is fire up another site collection, deploy our master page, blah, 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 blah. And all of this would just work. Each site collection gets its own copy of the app. So that really sets you up for a multiple development environment. So if you can actually now have multiple developers in the same web app, right? Just on different site collections without stepping on each other. And because everyone's getting a copy, then you just use source control, either Git or TFS, to sync up the code, right? That's how you keep the code in sync, by check-ins and checkouts and all this other good stuff. Okay, so now that we have that wired up and things are dynamic, let's go ahead and stamp out a couple of these. So block latest, that's just a summary for the block latest. And this is going to get very simple now. Close all but this. We just want to look at the components and just understand where you're grabbing your copy and paste. So just copy the entire component, drop it down here. JP block latest. And then now we just need the file name, block latest.html, and that's it. Sorry, I really wish it was harder, but that's it, we're done. So that component's built, and if we want to reference that in our master page, we just go to, we need to get out of this master page. We need to go to the home page here. The home page template. Okay, in the home page template, we got title, hello Deshaun, rich text editor. Where do we want to drop these guys? Let's drop these guys above the web part zone. See, our home page really doesn't. Let's look at the design again. We have to make some decisions here. Viewing Chrome. Our home page really doesn't have any content, right? So where should we put all that content? Maybe under the carousel, right? So we'll put our slider first, then we'll put all that HTML content in the middle, and then we had dropped in featured jobs, browse jobs, all this other good stuff. Okay, so if we go to our home page template, page layout, sorry. If we go to our home page layout, really we don't need any of this. I think that's why our page layout is not looking all that hot. So we have one web part zone. Do you really have a left web part zone? Oh no, this is flat. Okay, so we have one web part zone, then we have the page title, and then we have the hello Deshaun, right? Let's take a look at this. Yeah, we don't need all this. We don't need all this. So I'm torn. I'm just trying to figure out where to go ahead and slice this guy. Let's see. All right, so let's just call this main content JP main container. All right, and then everything after that. So before and after that. So what we have here as far as our block component, let's just drop that behind under this main content container. I forgot the name. So I'm gonna just copy this guy, go into the layout, and then just do open tag, and then put my hyphens in and replace the casing. and then close tag. All right. And then if we save this, so what do we need to save? We need to push up the layout. We need to push up the master page and the component. Oh, you can't do that because you're cross projects. They're going to two different low destinations. So let's publish this guy here. And then come back and publish our component. And if we wired this up correctly, we should see blocks summary. Latest blocks, we're missing images, but for the most part, we are good. And we'll talk about missing images and stuff like that. Yeah, so basically what needs to happen is that we need to make this dynamic to where it can locate these, the images path. Maybe that's another local variable that we can drop in to make that nice and neat. Okay, so this video is getting extremely long. So let's pause here. And then in the next video, we go through and clean this up and then drop in our other components to match the template. But we're wired up. We have a nice framework in place. The only thing that we're missing that would make this complete is some REST API calls and dealing with REST API JSON and displaying that in the actual template. But as far as dynamic content, the dynamic URL and a model to bring in various components to represent the HTML, we have that in place, and really we can just go ahead and start stamping these out. Okay, I'll catch you in the next video.